We don't live in an on-premises world any longer. Things live in the cloud. We're excited to move all of our applications and workloads there. But should we be moving things from the cloud back, specifically the operational model of the way we use our networks? In this episode of the Tech Field Day podcast, we postulate that on-premises networks need to work like cloud networks. Welcome to the Tech Field Day podcast, where we bring together a group of IT technical experts to discuss a single idea about key concepts in the industry. This podcast features a variety of perspectives from members of the Tech Field Day delegate community and is often associated with one of our events, such as Networking Field Day 35. Tech Field Day is a part of the Futurum Group, and this podcast is also published by our sister company, TechStrong. On this episode, recorded before Networking Field Day, I'd like to take a moment to introduce our delegates/guests before we jump into the premise for this episode, starting with Ron.
Thank you, Tom. Yes, Ron Westfall, Research Director at the Futurum Group, and I head up our networking coverage and definitely looking forward to our conversation.
Hi, my name is Jeremy Schulman. I go by Network Automaniac on Twitter/X, and I lead a organization at Major League Baseball that's transforming the network infrastructure team on the caveman to spaceman journey.
Hi, yeah, Chris Grundemann here. You can learn more about me at chrisgrundemann.com. I'm a network engineer by trade and now do lots of things in automation.
All right. Well, thank you all for joining us today. Let's jump into the premise for this podcast before we move forward. We all know what an on-premises network looks like. We've been operating them for decades. And we all know what the cloud is because we've been dealing with that for at least a decade at this point. And we know that there are cloud networks, and we know that they're a little bit different than on-premises networks. But should they be? In this episode of the Tech Field Day podcast, we would like to explore the premise that on-premises networks should work like cloud networks. I know, I just tossed a big one out there, and I can already hear people typing like they're ready to disagree with me. But I want to open the floor up to some of the experts here. What is it about cloud networks that differ from a traditional on-premises network?
Well, there's certainly a couple of things. And just like most things cloud, what we're essentially talking about is outsourcing, right? And so just like cloud compute is somebody else's computer, in large part, cloud networking is somebody else's network. And what's interesting, I think, about like modern enterprise networking is now we're stitching together these various networks that are run by someone else under the hood, but we still need control of them. And so I think, if you boil down far enough, there is an on-premises underneath that cloud somewhere. And so I think that leads back to our premise, which is that if the cloud providers can run an on-premise network in this way, why can't the rest of us?
Yes, and I think we see increasing choice here. For example, there's co-location implementations to help ease enterprise comfort with using a cloud type capability that's not strictly on their physical on-premise implementation. And also, I think we're seeing the cloud providers themselves saying, hey, we can deploy our servers and other capabilities at the customer's premise to basically combine, the best of on-premise with cloud. And so I think we're going to see more of this. I think another way of understanding it is what's called the hybrid cloud model, where we're seeing organizations warming up to, we want to keep certain capabilities, certain applications strictly on premise because of legal requirements, comfort zone, and so forth. But also we want to use the cloud where it makes the most sense, for customer facing interactions and so forth. And so really, I think what we're looking at is a blended world. That's really the destiny. That's a hybrid cloud world. And so on premises will increasingly emulate many of the best cloud practices. And also, I think the cloud providers and also cloud implementations will look to make it more comfortable so that it does parallel or emulate some of the best on-premises practices that have been around for decades, as you pointed out, Tom.
What I'm finding quite interesting is when people think about cloud networking and they operate cloud networks, that experience of operating cloud networks is still very different than the way we operate on-premise networks. And how do we bridge that gap? Because if we're wanting to treat our on-premises networks in a cloud-oriented operational model, I think there's a lot of work to be done there to figure that out. I think that there is an opportunity here, but I don't think we're there yet.
So I want to make a statement here, because this is something I was thinking about as I watched an old video that I made talking about the difference between operating a cloud network and an on-premises network. And it comes down to more than just mechanics. Like, my favorite thing is go ahead and log into your Amazon dashboard and click the button for this VM that says vMotion. And you'll find that there is no such button, because there is no concept of layer 2 in the cloud. Everything operates at a layer 3 level. But I wouldn't necessarily operate my data center in that way, because of the way that certain applications have certain kinds of interactions or things like that. But at the same time, I would never try to port applications that need things like vMotion or stretch layer 2 DCI in the cloud. Is part of our reaction to the way that these networks operate the fact that we're being forced to shift away from traditional development and deployment models like virtualization hypervisors to a more cloud-centric model such as Kubernetes and things like that?
To a degree, I think that's right, Tom, and I think you're definitely in the ballpark of what's going on here. To some degree, it's this limitation of choice is actually part of what allows cloud networks to operate the way that they can, right? And so that example of, we're running on layer 3, also maybe we're only buying a certain type of hardware, we're only deploying a certain network operating system, we're only allowing certain features. This limitation of options allows the network to be standardized at a level that allows it to be more of that kind of pets versus cattle model, right? Where turning up a new switch isn't a big deal, because we're not trying to figure out what all the weird stuff that we're doing in our network needs to be translated into this switch. We know that the network operates this way, period, right? And so I think in order to get a on-premise or kind of a traditional physical network that you may be operating for your organization more like a cloud network, I think standardization is a huge part of that. Now, standardization may look slightly different for each organization. There's certain things you can get away with telling people no on, and certain things you're going to have to say yes to. But I think standardization is a huge part of this. And then once you've standardized and you've got this kind of network policy standard of like, here's what we provide, the network is now a service to the rest of the business, and here's how you consume it, then it gets really easy to do some automation and some different things that the cloud providers do to provide that interface back to developers, back to apps, back to executives, that they can consume that physical network like a cloud, I think.
I think that there's kind of a bit of a challenge there, though. I mean, for one thing, I think when you operate, a multi-cloud environment, there is no standard, right? I mean, all the cloud providers, have their own ways of managing their own cloud infrastructure, much like, our on-premise network vendors have their own ways of managing the bits and the bobs, right? And I always find that the argument of, well, if we only had a standard that we could all adhere to, wouldn't it be great? And a lot of times that just doesn't quite happen the same way. So what I'm looking at is what are the fundamental principles that operating a cloud network can be applied to operating an on-premise network? Can we constrain the user experience much the same way the cloud providers constrain the user experience in a way that allows for some kind of basis to do a self-service model or a resource allocation model or something that allows them to have the same operational experience that they tend to enjoy. But there's no free lunch with that. I mean, when the network changes, do we version control our networks? Like, if you look at how enterprises might deploy networks in the cloud, they have perhaps Terraform files. Those Terraform files are version controlled. So they can literally version control their infrastructure, on a day basis, on a release basis. How can we achieve the same kind of experience with on-premise equipment? I would postulate we can. I mean, I believe it's possible to do this. It's not, but we're not doing this yet. And is that kind of along the vector of our discussion? Like, how can we do a thing with the on-premise network? If we had this capability, would we be closer to that operational model?
I think that's a fair point about standardization. I don't think the market's going to wait around for, a magic set of standards that can make everything a-okay. I think we've learned from history, yes, standards are important. They can level set, certain implementations and so forth. But I think the market is really driving, for example, the multi-cloud capabilities that are going to be fundamental, because any large organization out there, let alone business, is going to use, more than one cloud provider. It's just, diversity 101 in terms of having choice, in terms of having flexibility with the cloud journey. And each organization is going to have its own unique cloud journey in terms of how do we optimize the workloads? Are we going to keep this workload on premises because of, again, mandated legal reasons? Or can we actually transfer it to the cloud to gain the benefits of cloud economics or cloud flexibility, because now there's a sovereign cloud that's being offered? And what I mean by the marketplace is helping drive this. We're seeing cloud providers like Oracle Cloud and Google Cloud getting together to provide interconnects that logically enable the customer to use, say, an Oracle database natively through a Google Cloud interface. They don't have to use two separate silos to be able to make that work. And we're also seeing the same thing with Azure and Oracle Cloud. So this is moving forward without standards being in place. And I think a lot of this is just going to be up to the organization to decide how to pace their cloud journey. How do they want to optimize their workloads? And we're not going to be waiting for multi-cloud standards necessarily to make this happen.
Yeah, I think that's a really good point. And to be clear, while I think that the debate around global standards may still be raging, I tend to agree with both of you that that's not what we should be waiting for. When I say standardization, I mean inter-organization, or intra organization, right? So inside of your own organization, build some standards, right? We are going to provide these services, and this is how we're going to provide those services, right? And we are going to deploy these types of devices, and they have to have these capabilities. So building your own standards, your own policy framework inside, so that you're building your network to a standard that can then be modularized and automated the way that the cloud providers do. So then you can provide services instead of networks to your organization, right? And I think that's a big piece of this, is this service-oriented architecture, this idea that no one actually cares if it's a VLAN or a VXLAN or an MPLS tunnel or a GRE tunnel at the business level. They just don't care. And so what you need to define is, what are you actually providing to the business? And then if you do that in a really standard way, you can actually change things out underneath, and no one even knows if you switch from GRE to IPsec or from MPLS to VXLAN. In a lot of cases, you can do that without anyone knowing, as long as you haven't defined that in the product you're providing to the organization.
Yeah, I think the challenge there, though, I mean, it sounds great, and I would love to live in that world, because I'm trying to create that world, by going across teams to create standards or plan documents or whatever you want to call it, to say, let's collaborate together to agree on a thing, in advance of doing that thing. And the challenge has always been, if you're in the network engineering team, you might be fighting fires every day, and you don't have the luxury of time to sit down and plan. Now, we all would assert that that is necessary to do. Like, we need to sit down and plan something to the nth degree so it goes smoothly. But what you have is, your arch nemesis, Captain Chaos, and his cohort, General Disarray, running around going, well, I know I told you this thing, last week, and that's what was the plan, but we just found out that vendor X, slipped their schedule, and now we can't have that product, and burr, burr, burr. So, there is this rational element of, like, if you're going to try to create standards, and if you're going to try to operationalize your environment, much like you would try to do it with the cloud, there's planning involved. There's a deep set of planning that's involved that I don't know that every organization has that kind of cultural intuition to execute on.
I think a lot of it comes down to the fact that organizations also accrue a lot of technical debt over the years that they're forced to deal with. And I hinted about it when you come to things like vMotion, but I mean, we saw that when we transitioned a lot of these things into the cloud in the first place. Specialized hardware that must run in a certain way on a device, or networking protocols that are critical to the operation of the environment that probably should have never been configured in the first place. I'm looking right at you, GLBP, or ISSU, or a bunch of other things that we've come up with as solutions to make a more resilient, responsive network, when what we should have done was push back against the app developers and go, no, that's not how we build things. How dare you? Because kind of to Chris's point, standards aren't the solution to this problem. We have standards. The problem is we have too many of them. We have too much choice. We have too many ways to skin this cat, to use the common metaphor. What we need to do is take away choice. If there's two ways to do something, you don't know which way someone's going to pick. But if there's only one way exposed on the dashboard, I promise you I know which way you're going to pick, and I can plan appropriately. So
Yeah.
should we get into a situation where, as administrators, we are creating artificial boundaries that basically kind of set our people up for success by telling them there's really only one way to do this?
I agree with what Chris said, is that it has to be a service-oriented point of view. If you can agree on, here is the service, here's what matters to me as a business stakeholder, and I can express that desire through, in the case of cloud operations, through Terraform at the very low level, or through some other mechanism, for on-premise, or maybe even the same. I've seen people experiment with trying to use Terraform to provision, the low-level network. Doing it from that point of view, I wouldn't use the word constrain, but really curate that experience so that it's designed at that time to be what people want, rather than saying, here is the kitchen sink of all the various options. Go tell me what you want. It's like, I spoke with you. You told me what you wanted. Here's what you wanted. I built what you wanted. Here's the execution model. I think that's what the cloud providers, in a way, have done very well with their execution model. They said, here are the things that you need from cloud networking. Here are the ways that we're going to provide it to you. The cloud networking, the different providers have a different way of exposing those widgets. But at the same time, they're like, here's how the app people can take advantage of the network. And they gave them a way to do it. I think probably when we're talking about on-premise networks, is it possible that the network engineers just have a hard time saying no?
Yes, and I think that pivots with increased prioritization of building cloud native applications. That's something that I think is a clear trend. As we know, many applications that have been on premises for years, even decades, you just don't port them directly to the cloud. They, in many cases, have to be re-engineered in order to actually operate efficiently in a cloud implementation. And I think that parallels that excellent point, is that the conversations I've been having over the last 2 quarters at least is it's about the workload optimization. And I know I'm going to risk slings and arrows from Tom, and a lot of it is about AI workload optimization. And that, quite simply, I think is an excellent example of, here is a megatrend technology that is basically compelling organizations to simply get the best of both worlds as best as they can. That is, okay, what needs to be on premise or not in the cloud? And that is, on device AI inferencing is certainly something that immediately comes to mind, but it has to also be orchestrated and optimized with AI training in the cloud. The heavy lifting training that goes on with the AI clusters, running, hundreds, thousands of GPUs and so forth. So I think this is something that is going to continue to drive the conversation. Why on premises? Why cloud? How can we combine them, i.e. hybrid cloud, in an optimal way? And I think we're also seeing, key players like HPE with GreenLake, Lenovo with TrueScale, Dell with AI Factory, and Apex, basically literally positioning themselves to, make this happen. And I think that's going to be a big difference maker in the competitive landscape.
So, Ron, let me respond to that, because you've illustrated the point that at least I'm trying to drive at perfectly, because AI is a disruptor. Like, I cannot go cobble together a network running on 100 meg Ethernet and say, I would like to run on premises AI inferencing with a bunch of old NVIDIA Voodoo cards, 3DFX video cards. It just doesn't work, right? Because you're sitting there going, no, you must deploy this hardware. You must deploy these workloads. No, you cannot run this data center off of a 10 kVA UPS anymore. If you want to do this, you're going to have to bump it up. And disruptive technologies like AI or any other kind of thing that have very stringent requirements fix this problem, because either you're going to run it the way that they tell you to run it, or you're going to have to go buy that compute time or whatever from someone who has that capability, if it's in the cloud. Like that, to Jeremy's point, like, networking people don't like saying no. So if we show up with a pile of token ring cards, someone's going to say, well, I think we can try to make this work, because they don't want to try to tell the people, no, I'm sorry, you're going to have to actually invest in an ultra ethernet network, or you're going to have to put InfiniBand down here. To me, that shift of there is a technology that people want to utilize, which means we have to orient what we're doing around that technology. That is the biggest driver for operating these networks in that manner. Because if you try to operate an AI inferencing network like you would operate a traditional on-premises network, you're going to waste millions of dollars doing it, because little things like the tail end latency on a workload. Well, in a traditional network, I don't care when the packets show up. Like if they're 500 milliseconds late, it doesn't matter to me. Well, except when you're running 10,000 GPU cluster, if every packet is 500 milliseconds late, even that's an order of several orders of magnitude late. That's causing everything to rack up time, because those machines are sitting there idling, drawing power while they're waiting on everything to return. So you kind of almost have to create more structure around them in order to get them to work properly.
And I think choice is going to matter. I think that's a great point, Tom. Yes, there are going to be situation scenarios where, okay, they're going to have to invest more in, say, ultra Ethernet in order to, scale heavy lifting GPUs. However, I think there's also going to be choice, and that is right sizing the workloads. That is using small language models that can use, say, Intel and AMD CPUs on a distributed basis, so that you don't have to really do that, expensive cutover in order to succeed, in a Gen AI world. And I think that's just going to be part of the spectrum of what's going to evolve, what's going to happen in terms of the decision making.
I think something that helps with this potentially is, and again, going back to this idea of services, is taking that even a step further, where your network infrastructure team should be treated and should treat the rest of the business as if they were a service provider, right? I mean, a lot of these challenges we have with on-premises networking have been solved in service provider networks, and the reason is because they define a set of products and they build to those products, and then when a customer needs something else, they define a new product, a new service, and they figure out a way to build to it. I think you're right. I think Ron and Tom both said, the problem is, network engineers who are afraid to or unwilling to say no. I think if you change the model a little bit and look at this as a service that's being consumed, I mean, we're looked at as a cost center in most cases anyway. So let's take that all the way and look at this as a service we're providing. What is the service we want to provide? Okay, you want to build out an AI, data center? Great. Here's how, here's the network we can provide for that use case, and allow the team to focus on the other bits. And then that also allows potentially the outsourcing of networks. I think that Jeremy's right that not every organization is staffed for this model, but maybe that's okay. Maybe big enterprises that have the funding and the staffing to build out an internal service provider can do that, and smaller organizations, maybe they should be looking to partner with outside partners who can come in and operate this network for them in a very cloud-like manner, where they can consume these products, consume these services at a lower price than it would cost them to build out an entire team of developers, system engineers, and network architects to build the thing the way that it really should be built.
I think you just highlighted a really important point, which is, if an organization wants the benefit, the operational efficiencies, and all the good things that come with cloud, cloud operations for the network on the on-premise network, there's a human cost. Like, the Googles and the Azures and the Oracles, they have teams of people. They have software engineers building web UIs and control systems and, alerting and monitoring systems, and just all this infrastructure to give the end customer that experience, that self-service experience that allows them to, poof stand up a network or poof stand up a pod or whatever that they're trying to do. And to look at an organization, an enterprise organization, and say, well, we want the same thing. We want that same experience, and not have, an army of people, creating such a thing. I think is a misstep in expectations. Like people, people will expect something. They go to the networking team and they say, hey, I want this thing. And the networking team will say, well, when do you need it by? And they're like, I need it by tomorrow. And I'm like, do you really need it by tomorrow? I mean, maybe, what about next week? Oh yeah, next week would be fine too. And there's, I think there's still that subtle, there's got to be some pushback and negotiation between organizations about setting expectations, because if you want on-premise networks to operate like cloud networks, I think there is a operational infrastructure cost that has to go into that. And if an enterprise wants that, they're going to have to pay for it one way or another.
And I think that that maybe is where we need to get back to this, the realistic expectations of what we can deliver, whether it's an on-premises network or a cloud network. Once we reconcile the differences between those two things and we can actually deliver that to people, then they stop asking for those crazy, corner case type things. One of the biggest complaints that I can remember from this service oriented architecture back in the day was the reason why everybody wanted their network to operate like a cloud does is because they got tired of asking the networking team to provision something and it taking 3 weeks to get it done. What they didn't realize is that when that capability is put in your hands, it really does take 2 weeks to make that work for whatever reason. And they're just impatient because they think that things should be as immediate as clicking on a website when it's actually not.
But that's what they get with cloud networking. They get this instant gratification and an assurance of a quality deliverable. Like that is cloud, that's the cloud service offering. That's what people get out of the cloud. And everybody wants that for on-premise infrastructure. I mean, who wouldn't, right? But it comes at an enormous cost, right? And I don't think people really stop and think about, well, what does it take to deliver that kind of experience? And do you have the resources to not only build that infrastructure but maintain that infrastructure? It's like people who are on the automation journey. Once you write a script and you put that script into production, well, guess what? You got to support that for how long? It could be 10 years that you're supporting that thing. And that is a cost. It's a human cost. It's an engineering cost. So these benefits that we look for, they have costs, and people should try to think about those costs before they jump to, gosh, I want a thing. It's like a 5-year-old wanting to eat ice cream for breakfast. It's like, no.
It's a good point, Jeremy. I think that's also putting a spotlight on the economic factors. Yes, the technical challenges are there. There are many innovations that are helping it along. For example, bringing the AI to the data, like we're seeing with the Oracle HeatWave Gen AI implementation. That allows customers not have to go to an external third-party vector database in order to get those capabilities. And I think it's also underlying the fact that when it comes to cloud economics, people have the conventional notion that, oh, this is automatically going to create savings. Not necessarily going to do that in terms of the actual OpEx and CapEx. So why would people want to do more cloud implementations? It's because of these other factors: improving the user experience, improving the workforce experience, also being able to get time to value, and other factors that can actually improve overall business outcomes. And I think that's something that will continue to drive the decision making. How do we make the best of both worlds, on premise and the cloud? I don't think it's an either or proposition.
Yeah, I once had this conversation with a presenter who was kind of giving this time horizon view of the death of the on-premise data center, like because everything was going to the cloud. And I said, after he presented, I said, and at the time I was working at a startup company that was building software to build data centers. And so I was mildly concerned by his prognostications. And I said, do you really believe, that it's all going to go to the cloud? He said, no, absolutely not. There's always going to be, a minimum viable data center, something that has to be on-prem for whatever reason. It's connecting to bespoke hardware that needs, you can't put it in the cloud, or there's legal reasons like you discussed. And even managing just a small data center, in these times is as complicated as managing a big data center. I mean, you have the complications of the protocols and the interactions of all the bits and bobs. So there's still a cost to that, right? So even if people are looking at, well, what can I put into the cloud and what can I keep on-prem, there's still the complexity of running an on-premise network.
Well, as you can tell, the answer to this question is a little bit more complicated because there's a lot of things that come along with just simply changing the operational model of what we do. We have to examine what our workloads look like, how our developers operate, what our outcomes are supposed to be, and what we're dragging along with us along the way. And until you have answers to those questions, you shouldn't even be considering the operational model of your network. Until you get all the facts, you probably should keep doing things the way that you do them right now. But it doesn't mean you shouldn't look to the future, because one day, very soon, you may have that opportunity to turn a key and make everything more cloud-like. And that should make your day a little bit brighter. Thank you for listening to this episode of the Tech Field Day podcast. If you enjoyed this discussion, please subscribe on our YouTube or your favorite podcast application so you don't miss any of the episodes. And make sure you leave us a rating and a review. That helps everyone in the community understand a little bit more about who we are here. This podcast was brought to you by Tech Field Day, home of IT experts from across the enterprise, and part of the Futurum Group. For more upcoming information about events and episodes, head over to techfieldday.com/podcast. Thank you very much for listening, and we'll see you next week.